It's a pleasure for me to introduce one of our own this morning, Denise Hagan. Many of you know that Denise is a financial advisor, and she is an award-winning publisher and a guest speaker on topics for women. She's been helping women clean up their finances for about 30 years, but she's not going to be speaking about finances this morning. Today, Denise is going to be enlightening us on natural history of soap and soap making. And in fact, Denise makes handmade soaps using the herbs that she grows in her own garden. She's been helping women clean up with soap for more than 10 years. Here's Denise with the real soap opera. Everything you ever wanted to know about soap, but were afraid to ask.
Thank you, Susan. I'm thrilled to be here today to share with you one of my favorite hobbies, making handmade soaps. Handmade soaps are just so wonderful. Oh, can you hear me now? Okay, I'll start again. I'm thrilled to be here today to tell you about one of my favorite hobbies, making handmade soaps. Handmade soaps are so wonderful, and maybe I'll inspire you to try to do it yourself, but they smell good. They feel good. They feel so good on your skin. There's nothing artificial about them, and they're a simple and elegant piece of artwork, and they make wonderful gifts. We have some of these for later. So let's get started. Today we're going to talk about the history of soap, and then we're going to talk about making soap and some of the ingredients that are used in making soap. First of all, show of hands, how many of you have ever made a cake? Anybody? Oh, okay. Okay. Soap making is not difficult. If you can make a cake, you can make soap. Okay? All right, let's talk about what ingredients are in soap. Basically, there are only 3 ingredients. You can't get more simple than that. I mean, that's easier than making a cake. You have to have lye, you have to have a fat, and you have to have some type of liquid, usually water. Then what happens is the greasiness of the fat and the caustic nature of the lye combine, and over time you get a chemical process called saponification. That process neutralizes the caustic nature of the lye, which is an alkaline all the way on that side of the scale, and the greasy nature of the fats, and converts it into something just so wonderful. It's really kind of miraculous. Now let's talk about the root of the word. Saponification, the root is actually sapo, S-A-P-O. And you may think of it as a Latin root, but it actually has its origins in Celtic language. When the Celts invaded the Roman Empire, they made a big impression on the Romans in more ways than one. But some of the historians actually documented some of the things dealing with soap that the Celts brought to them. Excuse me. We have a Roman historian named Pliny the Elder. Now, he lived from 23 AD to 79 AD, and he wrote about the Celts and credits them with actually inventing soap and making a regular habit of bathing long before the Romans ever did. You might think of the Roman baths and think, well, didn't they clean themselves? They didn't use soap, and it was really more of a social event. They would anoint themselves with oil, and then they'd scrape that oil off of them, and some of the dirt would come off with it. There was another historian in 400 AD from Rome. His name was Ammianus Marcellinus, and he wrote, "The Gauls are very concerned with their appearance and hygiene. No Gaul is allowed to appear dirty or untidy in the country, no matter how poor they are." So obviously that was a big deal, that these people were clean even though they were barbarians. So in this country, every child who's ever had his mouth washed out with soap has the Celts to thank. Excuse me, I'm losing my voice. I just had my mouth washed out with soap. Okay, so we have the origins of soap in our time, but let's fast forward to 1399. King Henry IV instituted the Order of the Bath. And this was very unusual because people for some reason didn't bathe, they didn't get in water. I don't know if they were afraid of it or if that nice patina of film and grease and dirt just kept them from getting eaten alive by bugs. But King Henry IV instituted this order to prevail upon his noblemen to at least once in their lifetimes submerge themselves in a tub of water during the ritual of knighthood. So we have a once-in-a-lifetime bath. Okay, let's fast forward about 50 years to Queen Isabella of Spain. She was born in 1451, and she proudly proclaimed that she had had only 2 baths in her entire lifetime. Once when she was born, and once when she was married. So we're up to 2 times in a lifetime now. All right, let's move forward in history again, and we're now at Queen Elizabeth. She was born in 1533. Now her attendants were actually so impressed with her that they said she had a bath every 3 months, whether she needed it or not. Can you imagine the stench? Well, perfumes were very popular then, okay? All right, now, so we're having, all the royalty are beginning to make this thing popular using soap. So it started catching on with the everyday people. Then, wouldn't you know, something comes in to squelch the whole notion of using soap and bathing, and that was taxes. Oliver Cromwell, now he was born in 1599, so about 50 years or so after Queen Elizabeth had her magical every 3 months bath. Okay, he said he came into power, and I don't know if it was really because he saw it as a revenue source or because the Puritans were starting to get very prominent and they thought that getting naked was a bad thing. But he instituted a tax on soap, and it wasn't just a little tax, it was a punitive, excessive tax. It was so bad that he actually had tax collectors roaming the streets to collect the tax from the soap makers, and at nightfall they would go and lock the lids of the soap making pots so that nobody could sneak and make soap at night without the government getting its cut. It got so bad that in time the taxes on the soap equaled the cost of the soap. So only the wealthiest could use the soap at that time because it was so prohibitively expensive to buy. Well, when Gladstone came into power, he was Chancellor of the Exchequer, and that was around the mid-1800s. He abolished the soap tax, and he's purported to have said, "A clean nation is a happy nation." And I think we'd all agree. So Europe finally was on the verge of attaining the cleanliness that had only been previously known to the barbarians. All right, so that's over in Europe. Meanwhile, back on our side of the pond, we have our grandparents who had to make soap if they wanted it. It was a necessity. And it was pretty grueling. It was an all-day event. It had to be done outdoors because of the fumes and because of the boiling pots. You had to boil this outside. And they would collect animal fat from butchering and from any place they could possibly find it. They would collect all of this. It would usually still be attached to the meat and the bone of the animal, so they would have to render the fat. They would put it in a huge cauldron and melt it until the fat was liquefied, and then of course they had to scoop out and strain all of the meat and the hair and the dirt that was still associated with it so they could just get as pure an amount of fat as possible. They very frequently used tallow, which is beef fat. Then once they had the lye, they also, or excuse me, the fat, they had to get the lye. And the lye they got from wood ashes. And these are from all the fireplaces. They would save ashes from every single fire they burned because they need that to make the lye. They would put it in a bucket, or they'd actually build a hopper. And once they had the ash in it, and there were small holes in these wooden buckets, they would pour water, usually rainwater or spring water, into this bucket, and what would precipitate out would give them the lye. It was liquid lye. Now, as you can imagine, it wasn't an exact science, but the closest they came to determining if the lye was a consistent enough density was by using a raw egg. They wouldn't crack the egg, they would still be in the shell, but they'd put it in the lye, and if it floated, they knew that the lye was way too strong, and so they'd have to dilute it somewhat with water. If it sank to the bottom immediately, they knew it was too weak, and they'd have to take the water and pour it through the hopper again and get it a little stronger. But if it dropped ever so slowly to the bottom, they knew it was just right, sort of like Goldilocks. So, okay, now this soap, even with that mechanism of using the egg, was still not a precise science. It was very effective at cleaning, but it was pretty fierce. Okay, now if you didn't have to make your own, sometimes you were fortunate enough, if you didn't have time, that there would be door-to-door salesmen, the peddlers, who would bring soap to your door, or maybe you could get it at the general store, but it would be available in huge blocks, and they'd have to hack off a chunk of it for when you wanted to buy the soap. It wasn't exactly until 1830 that individually wrapped bars were available for people. But the whole commercial soap making business really didn't take off, and it was actually created by marriage, both literally and figuratively. But for a woman named Olivia Norris, one of the biggest names in soap making today might not exist. Olivia Norris got Procter & Gamble together. Now in 1930, William Procter was over in England, but he decided to just chuck it all because his wool shop had been destroyed by fire and burglary. So he came over to New York and he became a candle maker. He and his wife, Martha, decided, well, we're going to head west and make our way onto the frontier. They did that, but unfortunately along the way, Martha got sick. She got cholera, and so by the time they got to Ohio, she was so sick that they decided to stop so she could get medical treatment. She did pass away, and William didn't move from there. He was still in Cincinnati, but a short time later, he met Olivia. Okay, Olivia, he married her. She happened to be married to William, and her sister was Elizabeth. Elizabeth was already married to this guy named James Procter, who was a soaper. That's what they called soap makers, was soapers. And it was their father, Olivia and Elizabeth's father, his name was Alexander, who actually suggested, well, why don't you guys pool your resources? If you buy a bigger volume of tallow, because they both use tallow in candle making and in soap making, you can get a cheaper price on your materials. So they said, okay, that sounds good. They set up their business in 1837 in Cincinnati, and as they say, the rest is history. But along the way, they did make soap and candles, but there was this little thing called electricity, and Thomas Edison in about 1850 created the light bulb, and that pretty much squelched the whole candle making business. So they decided, well, we'll focus entirely on soap. That was the literal marriage, but the figurative marriage for commercial soap making taking off was when the soap manufacturers joined the fledgling advertising industry as a means to differentiate their soaps from one another and sell more of their product. They would buy full-page ads in magazines, and it wasn't short little snippets, it was almost like an essay where they would list a catalog of every single feature they could possibly think of for every one of their soaps. So they wouldn't want to leave any benefit unturned. So they differentiated their product that way, and just once they started out with print, and then they moved to radio, And that's where we get the term soap opera, because those dramas on radio were sponsored by the soap manufacturers. Now, just to name a few things that you might be familiar with because they still exist in one form or another today, have you heard of Cashmere Bouquet? Okay, that was created by Colgate in 1872. And then, here's I think of a funny story of a happy accident. A P&G employee went to lunch, completely forgot about his soap mixer and left it turned on. When he came back, there were such a copious amounts of air beat into his soap that the foreman almost said, oh, let's just boil it all down again, start over. But somebody said, no, wait a minute, I think we've got something here. It became the first floating soap, and they named it Ivory. Okay. Now, the inspiration for calling it Ivory actually came from the son of William. His name was Harley, and he was in church services one day and was inspired by the 45th Psalm. It's verse 8 to be exact if you want to read it. But ivory was one of the terms in the Psalm, and so that became the name. It was a white soap, and it floated, it was angelic, but their slogan was that it was 99 and 44 100% pure. I don't know what the other percentage was. But they were really the first one to create a slogan. You might have heard of Palmolive. Okay, Palmolive was a combination of palm oil, olive oil, and some cocoa butter. Then the Lever brothers came out with scare tactics in their advertising, and they actually coined the term BO. So nobody wanted to, they actually had an antiseptic soap, and it wasn't selling very well at all. For one thing, it was really stinky, and they had no particular hook to entice people to use it other than this antiseptic. So they changed the name to Lifebuoy, got rid of the smelly smell, you know, the real strong smell, and they coined this term BO, and so nobody wanted body odor, so they would buy Lifebuoy so that they would be saved. Okay, that's enough of the history of soaps. Some of the problems, though, with and what prompted people to start making their own soaps in modern times is that commercial soaps are very harsh. And it's not so much that they started out that way, but there's a component in every bar of handmade soap called glycerin. And glycerin is the portion of the soap that really gives you that tender softness, the feel that doesn't dry you out harshly. But it also has a lot of other commercial uses, and so what soap manufacturers would do would extract that portion of the soap before they actually sold the bar, and they'd sell off the glycerin for these other processes. So you came out with a very harsh bar, or even liquid soap that was very harsh. Remember I mentioned that the pioneers would create their own soap, or great-grandparents, out of the wood ash. They actually had the first liquid soap because that's a very good type of lye to use for liquid soap. But with the commercial manufacturers, it was still very harsh, and it came to really, it was impressed on me. Just not this past week, I had gone to. Has anyone ever been to the Carnegie Mansion on Cumberland Island?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, it's called Plum Orchard, and I don't know how many bathrooms this place has. I stopped counting, but all of them are outfitted with this one piece of equipment that I found fascinating. It's the shower mechanism over the tub has a diverter valve for shampoo. And you would take the bottle of liquid shampoo and screw it onto this diverter spout, and they did that because they didn't want to get their hands all crackly and dry from actually physically handling the liquid soap to wash their hair. So they would put it on this diverter spout, and when they were ready to wash their hair, they would turn on the shampoo knob, and it actually said shampoo on the ceramic. It would come through already diluted with the water and onto their head to wash their hair, so they didn't have to get their hands all wrinkly and cracked. So that just gives you an indication of the lengths that people with the enough means would go to avoid touching this stuff. So when you make soap, you get those nice calming, softening components in it because you don't strip them out. Now, I'm going to talk to you about making soap, but I wanted to first cover the safety points, and I'm not doing this to scare you away from making it because it is a whole lot of fun, and when you see something created from something completely useless, theoretically, to something that's really wonderful, it just makes you feel so good. Some safety issues. First of all, if you are going to make soap, remove all pets and children from the area because you don't want any inquisitive little fingers poking in it or little noses poking into this before it's actually ready to be soap. It is still caustic and it will burn them if they get into it. So get in a room where there are only adults, responsible adults. Then what you do is you cover your surface with newspaper. And several thicknesses of newspaper are good, and that's simply to protect whatever surface you happen to be working on. Unless you want a completely new kitchen remodel, then it's a perfect excuse. And that's just a catch because when you use the lye, today lye is in crystals, and some you can't help but maybe splash it a little sometimes, or a few granules get on there, and you won't notice it initially, but it'll gradually start eating a hole through things. You want to wear eye protection. Glasses are fine if you wear glasses, or you can wear goggles. Wear gloves, wear a long sleeve shirt of some kind. You don't wear anything fancy, but something that's protective. You can use an apron. I use this apron all the time for my soap making, and that'll just protect your clothing a little bit more. And this is the big thing. This is probably the biggest thing, I think, is to have a jar of vinegar at your side, just within arm's reach. You don't need to have it in a jar ready to go or anything exposed, but this is the great neutralizer. Remember I mentioned to you that lye is caustic and it's on the alkaline scale? Well, this is acidic, and so when you combine the two, the acid and the alkaline, it neutralizes it. And I find this very useful. I have been fortunate enough not to spill it as in a disaster all over my counter, but sometimes I might splash some inadvertently on my arm, but it would be so minuscule I wouldn't even notice it. And the way you notice that lye is eating away at you is that your skin starts to feel very slick. And so you start, if you notice that, that's the lye on there. And if you just take a couple of drops of vinegar and slap it on there, and you're good to go, and you can keep making your soap. Now with lye, there are a couple of issues I want you to be aware of. When you get lye today, it's in a crystalline form. You can hear that shaking. It's loose granules. When you mix it, you have to mix it with water, but don't measure your lye first and add water later, because the chemical reaction, any of you are chemistry teachers, will be so hot that you'll end up with Mount Vesuvius, and you don't want that all over your counter, unless of course you want the kitchen remodeling. All right, you also need a well-ventilated area. It's not as bad as when our grandparents were making it outdoors with the boiling, because fortunately they have what's called a cold process now, and you don't have to use constant boiling heat. But the lye does impart fumes, and so when you have the water and you pour the lye crystals in and mix it, it does give off some vapors, and you don't want to be staring right over the mix when you're doing that, because it'll go right up your nose, and that is not pleasant. So turn on the fans, the hood vent on the stove, or the circular fans. Open the doors, or if you're doing it out in the garage, leave the garage door open. Okay. The other thing about lye that I learned quite by accident is that you cannot get this very easily anymore, because unfortunately this is what drug dealers use to make meth. You know, take a good thing, and I found this out the hard way a number of years ago. I went to the grocery store, I needed to pick up a few things, and I have to admit, thinking back on it, I did notice that it was getting harder for me to find lye on the store shelves. But I happened to catch that they had about 6 bottles there of the lye, and I thought, oh, cool. So I scarfed them up with the rest of the things I was buying, and I got in line. And when I was in line waiting to check out, there was well, I'll use the term loosely, there was a gentleman in front of me. He was a real dirtbag. Oh. And he took an uncomfortable interest in what I was buying. And he kept staring at what I had in my basket and me and back and forth. And I had my business suit on and everything, but he said, if I didn't know better, I'd say you were making meth. I was shocked because at that time I didn't really know. I mean, I had heard of meth. I didn't know what it was made of. I still don't know what it's made of or how to make it, but not that I want to. But in any case, I said, well, I make soap, and you have to have lye for making soap. And then he whips out his ID. He's an undercover police officer. And he said, well, if I didn't know better, I'd follow you home. Because of course you can make meth in your kitchen, apparently. So, but that's where I make soap. So as far as I know, he didn't follow me home. Or if he did, he checked me out and I was okay. So you can get lye, but you can't get it off. You can't go to the Winn-Dixie or the grocery store or just grab it and buy it. They usually keep it behind the counter of places that do have it. I know some hardware stores have it, but you have to show your ID, your driver's license. They record everything where you live because I guess the law enforcement will want to check up on you just to make sure. So be forewarned with that. Okay, so enough about the safety issues. Let's talk about what you actually need to make this. All right, you need a pot to mix it in. Not as big as the cauldrons that our grandparents used, but a stainless steel bowl like this is great. You can use also an enamel covered pot, but do not use anything that would react with the lye. We're talking about things made of tin or aluminum. You also need a wide mouth jar. I use a canning jar for this, and it has to be heat resistant because this is where your lye mix is going to be in. I also use a scale. I just use my business postal scale, and I measure the containers so I know what their weight is, and then I can measure the ingredients that I add to it. You'll need a thermometer. This is another thing I found out the hard way. I thought my thermometers were all stainless steel. So I take one out, because you have to measure the temperature of the fat and the lye to make sure that they're kind of the same before you add the two together. Otherwise you end up with a goopy mess that doesn't turn into anything. But when I put this thermometer in the lye mixture, it started fizzing. So obviously it was made out of aluminum. So make sure you get a candy thermometer or something that can go to 100 degrees, not the ones that are up to 300, because your lye should never be over about 125, but something in that range that's stainless steel. Okay, you need some kind of a hot plate or a burner on your stove is fine, because that's what you're going to use to warm up the fat, because the fat temperature has to be at the heat level that the lye comes down to, because the lye starts very high and cools off. And then you need a mold. Now with molds you can get really creative. I'll show you some here. You can use a standard soap mold, this rectangular mold. This makes a nice 4-ounce bar. It's not particularly creative, but it's very functional. But you can also use different molds like ice cube trays. I get these, this is like shell shapes that you can put them in there, make all kinds of really neat shapes. I just found this for Easter. I don't know if you can see it or not, but it's eggshell, or it's the Easter eggs, decorative little designs in them, and it would make a really nice big bar of soap. And it's flexible, so it'd be real easy to pop the soap out of the mold when it's ready. But I also made some out. I found little heart-shaped ice cube molds. And what I did is I made soap that looked a creamy white, like white chocolate. And I popped it out, and they look so wonderful. They look like white chocolate hearts. So I got a red chocolate box and those little brown paper wrappers for individualized candies, and I put them in there and then put all of the hearts in there. Now you have to be sure that the person you give it to understands that it's soap. It won't kill you, but it won't taste very good. And then you'll be back to Lifebuoy and the Celts and wiping your mouth out with soap. Okay. All right. So you can also use things like cardboard boxes, shoe boxes, and then cut your bar of soap from the chunks, kind of like the old days they did in the general store. I've even used, you can really get creative with this, if you find some heavyweight plastic cracker trays. as long as they're heavy duty enough to withstand the weight of what you pour in, they make really interesting shapes. So you can kind of, the sky's the limit on what you can do with that, but it's a lot of fun. Let's talk about ingredients now. Okay, I've talked about lye. The amount of lye that you use is very critical. You should measure it by weight, not by volume. Now there are actually two types of lye. In the United States, Red Devil is very common for lye, but when you buy it, be sure that you don't go buy drain cleaner, because it's lye, but it also has metal shavings in it, and that would not feel very good on your skin. The kind that they sell in the United States, this like Red Devil for instance, is sodium hydroxide, and it's what we use most frequently. It's in the granulated form. But in the United Kingdom and our grandparents, they used potassium hydroxide, which is caustic potash from the wood ashes, and it behaves very differently. So you can use the potassium hydroxide for shampoos and things like that. It makes a very nice liquid soap. But I caution you, if you're looking at a recipe book on making soap, be sure you check the front pages to find out where the book was published. If it was published in the United Kingdom and they just use generic terms like lye, they're referring to potassium hydroxide, and it behaves differently with the fats than the sodium hydroxide does. So be sure that you're just checking that out to make sure you use the right kind of lye. Now fats, you can use just about any fat or oil you can get your hands on, but they all have different properties as well, and they will interact with the lye differently, so they're going to demand different amounts of lye depending on the fat you use. Some of my favorite oils to use right here, olive oil. Now you don't have to use extra virgin. Save that for your salad dressing. It's way too expensive to use for soap. But regular olive oil that's not blended with anything else, it makes a wonderful, silky, tiny bubbled soap. And that's what they call Castile. And actually that's what started me making soap, because I couldn't find Castile soap. So I ended up, well, it was a challenge. A friend of mine said, well, why don't you just make it? It's just olive oil. Okay, so I researched it, and that's the short version of how I got started with it, but it does make a wonderful soap. You can also use coconut oil. You can get this from Asian markets very easily. It makes a big bubbly soap, a hard white bar. You can use almond oil. I also find this at Asian and Indian markets. And you can even use things like castor oil, which, believe it or not, adding castor oil to your soap will do something called super fatting. That means you put in so much fat that the lye can't possibly absorb it all and change it in that chemical process. And so what's remained in your bar is like a lotion. So while you're cleaning your hands at the kitchen sink, you're cleaning it, but when you rinse it off, it feels like you already have lotion on your hands, and you don't have to do that. That's really nice. Okay, so you can also use things like tallow if you want, which is what a lot of the early Americans used, the beef fat, but you can also use bacon fat, lard, pork fat. And I know my parents used to save up all the bacon fat and fry everything in it. Okay, well, you know, we don't do that today so much, don't eat so much fried food. But it seemed a shame to me to bake all this bacon and then just throw the fat away. There should be something you can do with it. So I actually made some soap with it. And it's not too bad. It's a softer bar, softer than I would have expected, but it's a very nice bar of soap. So now there's an alternative to, you know, it's kind of like recycling your bacon. Okay, water. The amount of water you use is not as critical as the lye and the fat, but you do want to make sure you don't use tap water, because of all the chemicals that, you know, the chlorine and the things in it will affect the texture and the way your bar reacts. So you want to use either filtered water or distilled water or rainwater, something that's very pure and simple. Then once you have that, the only other real ingredient is patience. It's hard to wait sometimes, but you have to wait at least 4 to 8 weeks sometimes for that saponification process to take place. Yeah, you didn't know it took that long, did you? Now, let's talk about herbs, because this is where you can also get creative in it, what you can add to your soap. Remember that when you are making soap from scratch like this, anything you add to it will have to fight for its life to overcome the caustic nature of the lye. So it has to be really strong. And probably one of the easiest, most convenient ways to add some type of scent to your soap with herbs is using essential oil. And you can get these at health food stores, like this is lavender essential oil, and I use this all the time, but you can use peppermint, eucalyptus, rosemary, geranium, any kind of essential oil you can find, you can add to your soaps. Orange, tangerine, clove, the sky's the limit. But if you also want to add herbs that you grow in your garden, one of the favorite ways that I have for doing it is by making an infusion. And an infusion is just a fancy term for a really strong hot tea. So what you do is you'll take your pieces of your herb, like this is lavender, and you can put that in boiling hot water and just let it steep for the longest time until it's as strong as it can possibly get. It doesn't matter if it gets cold. It's actually better if it does, because remember, you've got to add lye to that, and the lye will heat it up automatically. And if you start with already a boiling cup of hot tea and then add lye to it, it's going to make it even hotter, and then you run into the Mount Vesuvius issue that you don't want. So you can add lavender. You can also add whole herbs, like when the lavender buds bloom, you can actually put the buds into the soap, and it gives it a really nice little decorative touch. The little blue and purple images of the lavender poke through. This is an aloe vera plant. Anybody know about the aloe vera with the burn? What you can do is just take off a leaf and peel out the interior of that, smash it all up, put it in a blender, add that to your soap, and then your soap will have some of those additional nice soothing properties. But you'll also find you get unusual reactions to things that you put in the soap. You might not think this, but if you put aloe in a soap, it turns the soap a faint pink color. And so you get all kinds of reactions. And what I actually do when I make my soap is I have my own little recipe book, kind of like my little, well, this one's blue, it's not a little black book, but it's my little soap book. And whenever I make a recipe, even one from another book, I write it down, and I write down what happened as I was making it, so that I know, and if I decide to make it again, I either can remember what the reactions are supposed to be, and that, oh, this is normal, this one takes only 2 minutes, and this one takes 2 days, and whatever it takes. But you'll have that, and then you'll be able to modify from that. And then when you get farther enough along that you can create your own recipes, you'll definitely want to write them down. Okay, so where are we? Oh, colors. You can add color to soap, but again, I like to keep everything really natural, so I don't venture too much beyond the actual ingredients. I told you aloe makes it kind of a light pink. Sometimes the fats themselves will impart a wonderful color. One of those fats that you can use is palm oil. If you buy palm oil and it's white, it's been bleached, because the original color of palm oil is orange. If you think about it, when the robins come migrating through here and they land in the palm trees and gorge themselves on the palm berries, those are orange, and that's how they get the wonderful color of their feathers. That same color can be imparted on your soaps, so it's wonderful for citrus flavored or scented soaps to have that palm oil as a base, because that bright orange will come through without you having to add any chemicals. You can also use just about any plant that stains. Blueberries, beets, grapes. You can even use spinach and carrots, but again, they'll have to fight through the lye, and they might change color just a little bit, but you can use just about any of those things, and you can experiment. Before I knew what would really color it, I thought, oh, tomatoes, they're red. I'll try that to get a red soap. Soap turned out to be brown, so but it's fun to experiment with it. Okay, now I'm going to go over the general process of making the soap in case any of you then want to venture into it. But you start out with the lye crystals that you've measured, you pour them into the water and stir that up. And while that's cooling down a bit, because it's way too hot to begin with, you measure your you measure your fat and put that on the burner so it warms up a bit. And you use your your thermometers to determine that. As you get more experienced, you can kind of feel and say, okay, this pot feels about the right, and then you mix it that way. But to start out, definitely use that stainless steel thermometer. Okay. Then what you do is you stir it, and sometimes it doesn't take a long time for it to get to the right point to pour it into molds. Other times it'll take maybe 2 days. Castile takes about 2 days of stirring on and off to get it. But initially you want to stir it constantly for about 15 minutes at least to get all the molecules surrounding each other so that lye and the fat really gets mixed in together. When it gets to the point where it's thick enough, they call it tracing. That's where you simply take your spatula or spoon, and if you can trace a pattern in the soap and it stays there for just a second or two before it dissolves back into a smooth pot of liquid, you know it's thick enough to pour into the molds if you want it unscented, or if you want to add some of your fillers like the herbs or the essential oils, that's the time to add it. And different things that you add may cause it to get real thick real fast, in which case you got to hurry up and pour it in the molds, and others won't have much of an effect at all initially. So that's when you do it. You pour it into those molds, and then I like to cover them with a piece of plastic wrap, because any surface of the soap that's curing, that's exposed to air, will develop a fine layer of ash. And you have to shave that off when the bars are finished curing, because it doesn't make for a nice soap, and it's kind of costly. Well, it just doesn't feel good and it doesn't look good. So I try to avoid and keep any air out of it that I possibly can. And then you throw an old blanket or towel on top of it to keep it kind of a medium warm temperature. You don't want it to shock it and get it cold or in a drafty area. I put it under a curio cabinet or someplace, again, where pets or children aren't going to dive into it. Once, in a couple of days, when the soap is firm enough, you pop it out, you trim it, you let it cure for the 4 to 8 weeks before you trim it, because it's still caustic unless you just want to handle it with gloves, literally. And there you have it. Then you have soap, and so the necessary skills of our grandparents now become the skills of artisans and craftspeople today. There is some great handout information at your table. It lists some of the great books involved and some of the websites if you decide to explore it more. Thank you. I don't know, do we have time for any questions? Are there any? No. Well, you can see me afterwards if you need to ask me any questions.
Won't you please put your hands together and thank Denise for this incredible presentation. And again, in the interest of time, if you have questions, she will be glad to talk to you afterwards. But thank you so much.
You're welcome.
And I do have a certificate for you, but I forgot it.
Oh.
So you're going to get it in the mail, but it's all done and ready to go. So I apologize for that. But thank you again.
You're welcome.
Don't go away.